Thanks, Bruce, and thanks everyone for coming out. It's great to see such a terrific turnout on this cold January night. For what I gather is the 12th time that Tom and I have collaborated on 100 Minutes About Something, and it's all made possible by our sponsors. The title for this year's Camden Conference, New World Disorder. Anyway, the title seems a little pessimistic, a little overdramatic, when, after all, hasn't the modern world been full of disorder? In the quarter century after World War II, at the height of the Cold War, which nearly exploded in October of 1963 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which approximately coincided with the beginning of our decade-long involvement in Vietnam, how was that for disorder? Climaxed, of course, by our military defeat, the capture of Saigon and South Vietnam by the North Vietnamese communists allied with Mao's China, or Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, followed by our quick and successful military response, which, of course, was only the prelude to more war and chaos in the Middle East. New world disorder? Indeed, but compared to the 20th century, the two world wars alone resulted in close to 100 million deaths. Maybe we're not doing so badly. Maybe we've learned from the events of those bloody 100 years. Maybe this century will be more like the relatively peaceful 19th century. But before we rest on our laurels, let's look back for a moment to the period between the two wars, the period that followed the war to end all wars, as Woodrow Wilson termed it when he announced to the American public the U.S. was entering World War I. History, that trite saying goes, never repeats itself, it rhymes, whatever that means. But even if the world of 1919 and the world of almost exactly 100 years later are very different places, it's always worthwhile to know our history and to know what went wrong, though we seldom seem to learn much from it. Or as Konrad Adenauer put it, history is the sum total of things that could have been avoided. So on that happy note, Tom, set the stage for tonight by taking us back to January 1919.
Well, of course, our story proper takes off with the opening of the Peace Conference in Paris on the 18th. But we wanted to take you around that January to see what else is going on that same month. So, for instance, President Wilson is already in Europe. He's arrived on the middle of December, and January 1st finds him in Rome, where he meets with Pope Benedict XV and with King Victor Emmanuel, the world's shortest king. And on the 6th of January, he goes up by train to Milan for a banquet. And at that banquet, he meets a young journalist whose name is Benito Mussolini. Mussolini records in his diary a very favorable impression of Wilson. Wilson records nothing about Mussolini. Meanwhile, in Germany, the German troops are back inside the pre-war boundaries. Now, that's only interesting if you remember that only 6 weeks earlier they were here. 6 weeks earlier. And that was the very moment when the Supreme Commander, Paul von Hindenburg, went to the Kaiser and said, the war is irreparably and hopelessly lost. We must sue for peace. And he convinces the Kaiser of that. Now, why, with such an advanced position, does he think the war is lost? Well, they're exhausted. They're out of materiel. The economy is essentially broke. And Austria-Hungary is about to surrender unconditionally, which leaves the southern border undefended and indefensible. So the Kaiser agrees, and they contact Wilson and sue for peace. Now, Hindenburg would like to keep his troops in their advanced position, but Wilson is having none of it, and he obliges them to return to the border, the pre-war 1914 borders. Meanwhile, in Holland, in the little town of Amerongen, the Kaiser, now a civilian, is adapting to his new life, and rather well. It's a pretty good life. He's doing a little house hunting. This is the modest residence they will move into later they will buy later that year and move into in 1920. And he lives on there in splendid style into his 80s, unrepentant to the very end. Meanwhile, in Paris, the British have taken over the entirety of the Majestic Hotel for the Peace Conference. They fill it with their diplomats, and it's adjacent to the Étoile, as you can see. and a young diplomat, Harold Nicholson, who's in his early 30s, arrives on January 4th. He will be one of the drafters of the peace conference. Meanwhile, in Oyster Bay, Long Island, ex-President Roosevelt has suddenly died unexpectedly, and the United States is in mourning. Meanwhile, in Boston, an enormous molasses tank filled to the absolute brim with molasses collapses under its own weight, and 11 people are drowned in molasses. This has nothing to do with our history, but who could resist, 35 states have now signed on to the 18th Amendment Prohibition, and a 36th is required to fully ratify it. And it comes the very next day. Nebraska becomes the 36th state, and Prohibition is about to become law. Meanwhile, in Paris, a young Vietnamese named Nguyen Tat Tan has petitioned the organizers of the peace conference to be allowed to represent Southeast Asia as a delegate and to plead for an end to colonial rule. The organizers refuse him indignantly because, of course, the interests of colonized people are perfectly well taken care of by the great powers that have colonized them. The world is going to hear more from him later, but that's beyond our story. Meanwhile, in Germany, at Schloss Wilhelmshohe, the Supreme Army Command, Paul von Hindenburg, and his second in command, Erich Ludendorff, are feeling a little better about things. Yes, Germany lost the war. Yes, they signed a demeaning armistice, but they didn't sign it. The army didn't sign it. The government signed it, and not the Kaiser's government. The Kaiser had already abdicated at the time of the signing. It was signed by the new socialist government. And socialist, as we all know, means, at least in Hindenburg's mind, Jew. And now he's starting to flirt with some alternative facts. The alternative facts he's thinking about is maybe Germany didn't lose the war. Maybe they were stabbed in the back by the socialists back home. And that becomes the theme of his memoirs, which are published in May of 1920. Meanwhile, in Paris, Wilson is back, takes up residence in his modest rented quarters at 28 Rue Monceau, ready to begin the peace conference. Mac, tell us a bit about Wilson.
Well, Woodrow Wilson was one of our most famous presidents, a devout Christian with progressive political principles, and a Southerner, the first Southerner to be elected president since Zachary Taylor in 1848. He was born in Virginia 5 years before the outbreak of our Civil War, raised in Georgia during the Civil War. He was originally, hardly surprisingly, quite conservative in his views. He was to become increasingly liberal during his tenure as the president of Princeton University in the first decade of the 20th century. Entering politics in 1910, Wilson was elected governor of New Jersey on a reform platform, which was to give him sufficient national recognition that he won the Democratic presidential nomination in 1912. Not quite overwhelmingly, it took 46 rounds of votes for him to get the nomination. He was, however, to win the presidency with a large electoral college majority after former President Teddy Roosevelt's third-party candidacy split the Republican vote. Having kept the U.S. out of World War I, Wilson was reelected in 1916, so this time running against a united Republican Party with a much narrower victory margin. That fall of 1916, war fever was rising in the United States, hardly surprisingly after German U-boats had sunk the Lusitania. What in the world were the Germans thinking? Well, let me give you a brief glimpse into the German view of the United States before we entered the war. In a fascinating book by Henry Morgenthau, he wrote of a meeting he had with German Foreign Minister von Jagow and Foreign Secretary Zimmermann, author of the notorious Zimmermann telegram. Morgenthau was returning from Constantinople to the United States in February of 1916. And passing through Berlin, he called on von Jagow and Zimmermann, urging Germany to apologize for the sinking of the Lusitania. Von Jagow said it would be impossible for his government to do that. public opinion, German public opinion, would not permit it. Morgenthau explained that without such an apology, the United States might well enter the war. The trouble is, and this is a quote from the book that Morgenthau was to write a couple of years later, the trouble is you Germans don't understand my country, he told them. You don't think that the United States will fight. You think that President Wilson is an idealist, a man of peace, and that under no circumstances will he take up arms. You're making the greatest and most costly mistake that any nation can make. Do not forget, Morgenthau said, the President has Scotch-Irish blood in him. The Scotch side, sure, it makes him cautious, patient, long-suffering, but he also has the fire and combativeness of the Irish. If he decides to fight, he will fight with all his soul and to the bitter end. Morgenthau noted in his book that the foreign minister, the German foreign minister, was amazed at his description of Wilson. We regard him absolutely as a man of peace, this is von Jagow replying, nor do we believe that the American people will fight. They are far from the scene of action. What, after all, have they to fight for in Europe? A little more than a year later, it was April 2nd, 1917, Wilson spoke before a joint session of Congress, urging the United States to enter the war against Germany. The U.S. would fight for nothing less than the ultimate peace of the world and for the liberation of its people. The world must be made safe for democracy, Wilson proclaimed, to growing parliamentary bipartisan applause. A visionary, Wilson, frustrated that the United States had been forced to enter the war, he developed a set of principles, the most famous, the 14 points, the most significant and memorable one being the last point, the League of Nations. His vision was clearly an idealistic one, a general association of nations, he described the League, for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small nations alike. Now let me quickly go over the other 13 points. The first 5 were general ones for all nations to obey, open covenants of peace openly arrived at, absolute freedom of navigation, the removal of all economic barriers to trade, national armaments to be reduced to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety, free and absolutely impartial adjustment of colonial claims. The next 8 points related to specific European countries following the breakup of the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires. And finally, the 14th, the last and Wilson's key point, the creation of the League of Nations. French Premier Clemenceau mocked the grandiosity of Wilson's vision. God was satisfied with 10 commandments. Wilson gives us 14. But most of the rest of the world hardly embraced Wilson's concepts. Even old Rough Rider Teddy Roosevelt, who, remember, had lost to Wilson in the 1912 elections, told the New York Times he was much pleased with the 14 points. But if the world was generally impressed with Wilson's idealism, the results were a lot less impressive. Politics shortly resumed its natural state, with Roosevelt quickly backing off from his support, writing that the League of Nations was a product of men who want everyone to float to heaven on a sloppy sea of universal mush. Harold Nicholson, the British diplomat Tom mentioned earlier, was a decade later to compare Wilson's vision with the results. Open covenants of peace, Nicholson noted, were not openly arrived at. Freedom of the seas was not secured. A set of tariff walls were erected higher and more numerous than any known before. National armaments were not reduced. The German colonies were distributed among the victors in a manner which was neither free nor open-minded nor impartial. Russia was not considered at all. The frontiers of Italy were not adjusted along the lines of nationality. The Turkish portions of the Ottoman Empire were not assured a secure sovereignty. The territories of Poland include many who are indisputably not Polish. And finally, reviewing the League of Nations, Nicholson stated that the League has not been able to assure independence to great and small nations alike. Provinces and peoples were in fact treated as pawns and chattels. He concluded by noting that elements of discord and antagonism were in fact perpetuated by Wilson's League. But as usual, I'm a little ahead of the narrative. Tom, let's go to Paris for that lengthy conference after the war ended.
The conference to settle the Great War convenes in Paris on January 18th, 1919, in the French Foreign Ministry building on the Quai d'Orsay. Still there, by the way. You can go to visit that. Of course, the purpose of the conference was to settle the peace, but based on what? Well, based on what the Germans had surrendered upon. They had surrendered, citing specifically suing for a peace based on Wilson's 14 points. Sounds easy, right? I mean, you start with 1, go through to 14, write it all up, sign the document, shake hands, and go home. But it wasn't so easy because there were so many different delegates. Actually, there were 32 different delegations there. We just chose one of the delegates at random to show you the kind of people that were there. The big four, of course, were Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of England, Georges Clemenceau, Prime Minister of France, and Vittorio Orlando, the Prime Minister of Italy. Note that each of them is the head of government, professional politicians. In spite of being head of government, none of the four has a totally commanding position with respect to the government back home, because each one has got a powerful adversary in the wings, and not present at the conference, but ready to pounce on their head of government should anything be agreed at the conference that they don't like. And all 8 of these guys have got different goals for what the conference ought to be trying to pull off. For instance, Wilson, all he cares about is the League. Most of the others are positively lukewarm on the League, and Henry Cabot Lodge is dead set against it. Most of the 8 would just as soon see Germany eventually rebuilt and readmitted into the family of nations. So here's that group. But Clemenceau is not part of that group. He's only interested in reparations. And Raymond Poincaré, the president of France, would just as soon see Germany forever after left in ashes. Orlando's needs are much simpler. He's in it for the booty. He wants to be sure that Italy gets a big share of the spoils of war. All are going to be disappointed. They're all going to be disappointed. Number 2 on everybody's list, I guess, was a peace that lasts, right? As they think about a long-lasting peace, their minds have got to travel back to that much earlier, or a century earlier, peace conference, the one that settled the Napoleonic War, the 1815 Congress of Vienna. It had given the world a pretty decent 19th century, almost a century of peace. A few minor flare-ups in the middle, but no conflagration, no world war as a result of that. It too had a big 4: Talleyrand of France, Nesselrode, Talleyrand is the foreign minister of France, Nesselrode, the foreign minister of Russia, Metternich, the foreign minister of Austria, and Lord Castlereagh, the foreign minister of England. None of them is a head of government. They're professional diplomats. So professional diplomats in Vienna in 1815, professional politicians in Paris in 1919. And the other thing is, Talleyrand represents France. France was the defeated nation in the Napoleonic Wars. The defeated nation in the First World War, Germany, is not invited to the peace conference at all. Now, might those two differences result in a conference that was less of a long-lasting, gave us less of a long-lasting peace? The delegates certainly hoped that wouldn't be true, and one of them in particular thought he had a pretty good recipe for a long-lasting peace, maybe an eternal peace.
In fact, in early 1918, addressing both houses of Congress, President Wilson had outlined exactly what he had in mind, stressing his demand that the world be made fit and safe to live in by adopting a program for the world's peace, the only possible program. He was to find that it was a lot easier to win a war against the enemy, Germany, than to persuade his allies, the French and the English, how the post-war should play out. Wilson was to spend most of the first half of 1919 in Europe. He was back in Washington for only 6 weeks during that entire 6-month period, having arrived in Europe on the SS George Washington, December 13th, 1918, the first president of the United States to set foot on European soil. In retrospect, when we see how frequently American presidents travel abroad these days, it's hard to appreciate how important Wilson's visit was. It was a fitting symbol of how American prestige and power had grown as a result of our key role in the Allied victory against Germany. Now, Wilson was hardly what you would call a charismatic figure, but the French loved him, as did all the Europeans, except, of course, the Germans. For Wilson, his proposed League of Nations was far and away the most important of his 14 points. Its success would not merely justify American involvement in the war, but would serve a truly noble cause, the moral climax of this, the culminating and final war for human liberty. Wilson was soon to be brought back to reality. At his first encounter with French Premier Clemenceau agreed with Wilson that it was worthwhile to try to create the League of Nations, but he told him he very much doubted it would succeed. What Clemenceau was really expressing was the general European attitude, that Wilson's idealistic vision, well, it was a fine idea, but that what was really important was creating a peace treaty that rewarded the Allies and punished the Germans. Lord Curzon, who was to become Britain's foreign secretary later that year, wrote the British ambassador in Paris during the opening days of the Paris conference of his disdain for Wilson's obsession. The League had nothing whatever to do with the war or with the immediate task of concluding the peace. Meanwhile, the French ambassador in London, Paul Cambon, was equally dismissive of Wilson's vision, deriding Wilson as unversed in European politics, out of touch with the real world. Nor were Europeans the only ones who saw the League as an idealistic folly. In a conversation ex-President Roosevelt had with Senator Henry Cabot Lodge in January of 1919, coincidentally, it was just 2 weeks before Roosevelt's sudden death, he mocked Wilson. The American people should make it perfectly clear that we do not intend to adopt the position of an international meddlesome Matty. By that time, the League had already become a very divisive issue in the United States. Many Republican congressmen were so opposed to it that they were discussing how they might detach the League from the actual Versailles Treaty so they could then vote it down. In early March of 1919, during the time that Wilson was briefly back in Washington from the peace talks, Lodge gave a key speech in which he asked rhetorically, "What is it that delays the peace with Germany?" and quickly answered his own question. Discussions over the League of Nations, nothing else. Nor was Wilson's commitment to the League just dragging out the peace conference. It was also giving the other allies, especially the French, ample opportunity to gain concessions from Wilson on various other elements of the treaty. The reality was that Wilson and his European allies approached the peace discussions with starkly different visions. Wilson's great principle was that self-determination must prevail in the many nations created in the wake of the disappearance of the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires. For example, he was to spend hours during the peace talks promoting the creation of an independent Kurdistan carved out of the Ottoman Empire. France, as Clemenceau repeatedly made clear, had little interest in self-determination. His focus, as one historian has described it, was the simple castration of Germany. Lloyd George famously described negotiating with the idealistic Wilson and the tough-minded Clemenceau as like being seated between Jesus Christ and Napoleon. Wilson indeed was to complain to Clemenceau when he returned to Paris later in March that the reparations you are proposing, carrying with it an excessive burden of taxation for generations, would be the greatest encouragement to the German people to go over to Bolshevism. Prescient indeed, though it wasn't, of course, Bolshevism that the German people ultimately embraced. By early April, Wilson was exhausted. He collapsed. He had 103 temperature. With the talks entering their 4th month, a physically weakened Wilson was virtually being held hostage by the Allies over his League. When he emerged from his sickbed in the 2nd week of April, In order to get agreement on the League, he was ready to concede points that he had earlier rejected, the key one of which was the clause that he'd been so strongly against, the one that would demand enormous reparations from Germany. Italy, meanwhile, felt strongly that Wilson was not sufficiently looking out for its interest. Italy had been persuaded to enter the war in 1915 by the secret Treaty of London, in which Britain, France, and Russia had promised Italy a chunk of Slovenia as well as the northern part of the Dalmatian coast. Wilson's self-determination focus was clearly at odds with the treaty's promises to Italy, and when Wilson continued to refuse to agree to the Italian demands, in late April, Prime Minister Orlando walked out of the peace negotiations. In Asia, Japan had seen an opportunity when the war first broke out and had negotiated a deal with England entering the war in the fall of 1914. And Wilson was forced to backtrack once again on his self-determination ideal, giving in to the Japanese demand to annex Shantung, an area on the Chinese mainland. The Chinese ambassador to Washington, Wellington Koo, was furious that Wilson had capitulated to the Japanese demand, calling it a dagger pointed at the heart of China. In Hunan, meanwhile, a young Chinese college graduate, starting his career as a journalist, responded to the Shantung concession with a bitter editorial. "This has awakened us. If we do not rise up and fight, who will rise up and fight?" The European allies, meanwhile, had grown even more emboldened and even more contemptuous of Wilson. Winston Churchill, who was at this point England's Secretary of State for War, was boasting that as a result of their victory, the British victory over Germany, in every country now it is to the British way of doing things that they are looking, foreshadowing a comment he was to make to a New York newspaper 15 years later. He was in the States in the 1930s, was interviewed by the New York Times, and he said, "America should have minded her own business and stayed out of the World War. If you hadn't entered, the Allies would have made peace with Germany in the spring of 1917. Then there would have been no collapse in Russia followed by communism, no breakdown in Italy followed by fascism, and Germany would not have enthroned Nazism." The peace treaty was finally signed on June 28, 1919. Ironically, 5 years to the day the Austrian Archduke Ferdinand had been assassinated in Sarajevo. The final settlement was hardly what Wilson had envisioned when he first arrived in Paris more than 6 months earlier. The economist John Maynard Keynes repeatedly referred to it as a Carthaginian peace, one so brutal that it would completely destroy Germany. But that wasn't everyone's opinion. The most accurate conclusion, almost to the day, was the pessimistic one of France's Marshal Foch. Foch had been the supreme Allied commander during the last year of the war. "This is not a peace," he was to complain on the day it was signed, June 28, 1919. "It's an armistice for 20 years. Not a bad prediction. 20 years and 64 days later, World War II broke out.
We need to back up 20 years and 64 days to talk about the Weimar Republic, famous for what? Hyperinflation, right? Well, usually hyperinflation means a government has lost all sense of discipline. It has just running the printing presses to keep the good times rolling. But that's not at all what the case was of the German hyperinflation, which was due entirely to the reparations that Mac had mentioned. The amount of reparations was not based on Germany's ability to pay. It was based on what the Allies felt they needed to make themselves whole again. Germany can't pay that much. The economy's wrecked. They've got 3 million war dead and 4.2 million wounded. So the cream of the labor force is gone. Many of them are not only out of the labor force, but are on the dole. The economy is a wreck. And yet the Allies are determined to have their pound of flesh. By 1923, they are in default. The Germans are in default of the reparations payments. And the French and the Belgians move their armies into the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland of Germany, and take over the factories and run them for their own benefit, paying themselves the reparations. Of course, that makes the German economy even worse. And all they can think to do is to use the printing press to try to shock the economy with a sudden influx of printed money. But instead of shocking the economy, it just inflates it to the point that by the end of 1923, a loaf of bread cost a wheelbarrow full of money, 200 billion marks to buy a loaf of bread. At this point, a striking figure arises in Germany, one that I wasn't aware of before we started to do this research. His name is Gustav Stressman, and he is a 41-year-old German, 45-year-old Berlin politician. He's got an undistinguished career up to this point, but look out, world, because from 1923 until 1929, he serves variously as chancellor and as foreign minister. And he is no sooner made chancellor than he's confronted with a rebellion, an honest-to-God rebellion in his ranks, the famous Munich beer hall putsch, November 1923. A putsch is an attempt to overthrow the government with violence. So as Stressman sees it, it's an act of high treason. He arrests the whole bunch of them and puts them on trial for high treason. In particular, the two ringleaders, Ludendorff and the other guy. He puts them on trial, has them tried, convicted, and jailed, and he throws away the key. As far as he's concerned, these two guys could spend the rest of their lives behind bars. Now, it doesn't work out that way, as you know, but it's not Stressman's fault. He needs to do something about the economy, and he needs help from abroad. And he finds a sympathetic thinker in the Wall Street banker Charles G. Dawes. Dawes later becomes vice president under Coolidge, but at this point he's just a financial guy living in New York. But he understands, like many Wall Streeters, that Germany as a failed state is not in anybody's best interest. And so he comes up with, in consultation with Stressman, the so-called Dawes Plan, which is more or less the Marshall Plan version 0. It's got 4 elements: to take the foreign troops out of the Ruhr Valley, to do reparations, reduced and rescheduled, a huge bond issue to fund a new currency, the Rentenmark. And the result, in spite of what the naysayers are saying, the result is surprising. Germany begins to rebound. It is making regular payments on its bond issues and even beginning to pay now the stretched out reparations. And the result is that Dawes wins the 1925 Nobel Peace Prize. Stressman also wins the Nobel Peace Prize, but not that year. He has to do one more miracle to pull that off. I'll tell you about that a little later. The economy is not only rebounding, it's starting to hum. In fact, it's so good that people later on look back at this period and call it the golden years. Die goldene zwanzige Jahre. The golden years, a flowering of the arts and of the sciences, including architects like Walter Gropius and the Bauhaus, physicists Heisenberg and Einstein, authors and composers, too numerous to mention. A renaissance. I mean, look at this. 1923, Germany's flat on its back. 1925, 26, they're thinking of it as the golden years. The golden years. On October 3rd, 1929, Gustav Stressman dies unexpectedly of a stroke. He's 51 years old. The Wall Street crash comes 3 weeks later with the Depression right behind it. Die goldene zwanzige Jahre are over.
Meanwhile, back in the United States, Congress was about to ruin Wilson's idealistic plans. President Wilson had left Paris the very day, June 28th, the treaty was signed, sailing again on the USS Washington, and docking in New York 10 days later. By midnight, July 8th, he was back in the White House, a man on a mission to get the treaty approved by the Senate, but more importantly, to get the U.S. to join the League of Nations. The morning of July 10th, barely 36 hours after he arrived home, he was up on Capitol Hill to promote the treaty, carrying it with him. He was the first president, and no doubt the last, to physically deliver a treaty to Congress. His speech was long, nearly 40 minutes. While it concluded with some soaring rhetoric, "Dare we reject this treaty," he asked, "and break the heart of the world? It has come about by no plan of ours, but by the hand of God."
Not given to understatement.
His speech generally, though, was lackluster. A Democratic colleague wrote in his diary that he was petrified with surprise. His audience wanted raw meat. Wilson gave them cold turnips. Republicans were, of course, even more disdaining, "a mere soap bubble of oratory," one commented. Except for his brief return in late February to Washington, Wilson had been away for half a year at a time when his health was deteriorating, and he was unaware that not only did he obviously lack support from isolationist reactionaries on the Republican side of the aisle, but as well from many disenchanted liberals in his own party. The Republicans, led by Wilson's nemesis, Henry Cabot Lodge, had been plotting since Wilson left for Paris. They had made up their mind before they knew any details about the treaty or the League of Nations that they were going to wreck it, a Republican congressman would later admit. Unfortunately for Wilson, Lodge was more than a formidable opponent. Henry Adams, from an equally well-known Boston family, and in fact he had been a mentor to Lodge during Lodge's years at Harvard, was to write that Lodge suffered from Bostonitis, symptoms of which he described as chronic irritability and thinking too much of oneself. Though Adams did grant that Lodge, his protege, was an excellent talker, a ready wit, an accomplished orator with a clear mind and a powerful memory. Ignoring the fact that the Republicans controlled both houses of Congress, Wilson would, as Lodge foresaw, refuse to compromise. Lodge's plan, rather than a direct frontal attack against the treaty, was to propose key reservations. "But suppose the President accepts the treaty with your reservations," a Republican colleague asked Lodge. "Then we're in the treaty, right?" "Never, under any set of circumstances in this world," Lodge replied, "would Wilson be induced to accept a treaty with Lodge reservations appended to it." Lodge clearly had Wilson's number. By late August, aware that his treaty and his league was at great risk, Wilson decided to tour the country from coast to coast to build up support. It would prove to be a near fatal experience for the man and a totally fatal experience for his treaty and his league. He had complained to his doctor from the beginning about the terrible headaches he was having. They only got worse. He was to give 2 talks a day, sometimes 3. I mean, it was a very, very hectic schedule. Heading back east on September 25th, he was in Pueblo, Colorado, where he gave his 40th and last speech, suffering a stroke that night. The rest of the trip obviously was canceled. His train took him straight home. A few days after arriving back in Washington, he was to have another stroke, a massive one. This one left him partially paralyzed on his left side. Although Wilson was to make a limited recovery over time, he was never physically or mentally to be the man he had been. His wife, Edith, suggested that he be permitted to resign and be succeeded by Thomas Marshall, his vice president and a former governor of Indiana. So history does indeed repeat itself. Ironically, she was talked out of it by one of Wilson's doctors, who claimed that as Wilson had staked his life on the ratification of the treaty, were he to resign, his greatest incentive to recovery would be gone. "So began my stewardship," Wilson's wife Edith was later to write. It was to continue for the rest of his presidency, nearly a year and a half, as his physical health slightly improved, but his mental deterioration continued. Lodge and Wilson remained at odds. The treaty continued to make its way through the Senate that fall, with the Republicans managing to get a few minor changes attached to it. The treaty was ultimately defeated by a mixture of irreconcilable Republicans along with some Democrats who followed Wilson's bidding to reject any form of compromise. The following March, some Democrats teamed with moderate Republicans for a last-ditch effort. But when the Senate voted on it for the final time in March 1920, it still fell 2 votes short of the 2/3 majority necessary. Obviously, had Wilson backed the minor changes Lodge and his Republicans wanted, the treaty would have passed. But Wilson always maintained that he'd been right to reject compromise. The U.S. later signed separate peace treaties with Germany, Austria, and Hungary, but we never joined Wilson's League of Nations. Wilson lingered in deteriorating health until 1924. His wife, Edith, survived for decades, making her last public appearance when John F. Kennedy was president. But that's nearly a half century ahead of our game. Tom, take us back, way back, and tell us about the rise of fascism.
Fascism doesn't arise in Germany. We first see it in Italy, where it is attributed largely to one man, Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was a person with a fixed idea in his head. He felt his mission was to recreate the glory of the Roman Empire, to form a second Roman Empire. So we've entitled this section, Making Italy Great Again. At the outbreak of the war, or just prior to the outbreak of the war, Italy had been part of the Triple Alliance, allied with Germany and Austria. But that was a defensive alliance, and so when Austria attacked Serbia, Italy declined to come to its support and declared itself neutral, to the vast relief of many Italians who foresaw a really disastrous war. But Mussolini was not one of them. Mussolini is furious at this development. He wants to get Germany into the war. He forms his own newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, and he makes the case that we can't be a great country if we are sitting out a world war. We've got to get into this war. And so he begins to bang the drum to get Italy into the war. The man is talented and energetic. He's a spectacular speaker. He's turning out these enormous rallies, pro-war rallies, like this one in Bologna in 1915. Italy hasn't decided if it's going to get back into the war, which side it's going to get in on, and these people don't seem to care. They just want in, right? Sure enough, Italy later that year enters the war on the side of Britain and France, and it's an enormously popular move. The best day of any war is the first day. Mussolini signs up, September 1915. He fights in the Alps. He rises to the rank of Lance Sergeant, and the war is a disaster for everybody, but particularly for Italy. They have the financial ruin. The economy, it craters. They have 2.4 million casualties. One of them was my Italian grandfather, Dr. Tommaso Andrea De Marco, who in 1916 went back to Italy he was a Boston surgeon. He left Boston, went back to Italy to be what help he could. He ran a field surgery in the Tyrol and survived the war, but came back a shattered man. He could never operate again, never went into a surgery theater again, and died in his early 40s. Mussolini, too, is invalided out in February 1917 with 40 plus mortar fragments in his body. Once he's out of the hospital, he is 34 years old. He's still got a newspaper, so he's a journalist. He's not quite clear what his politics are. He knows he's a nationalist. He knows he's a populist. But he's not thinking fascist yet. But that's about to change. Also about to change is his love life. That happens with the arrival of a new cub reporter on Il Popolo d'Italia. Her name is Margherita Sarfatti. She's young, she's pretty, she's Jewish. She is hugely intellectual, and Mussolini is bowled over. He's possibly never met a woman that he identified as being smarter than himself, but she is. And they become lovers, and he has other lovers during his life, but this is the real thing. They are together for more than 10 years. She also, she's like many Jews in Italy, she comes from Venice, where she was brought up fairly wealthy. She lived in a palace, which is still there. It's called Palazzo Bembo on the Grand Canal. And her father, a well-known public figure in Venice, is the founder of the Vaporetto network, the Vaporetti that still ply the canals of Venice today. She becomes Mussolini's speechwriter and eventually rises to the editorial desk where she's writing editorials over his signature that he doesn't even bother to read. That's how good she is at channeling the man. I mean, she is Sarah Huckabee Sanders for an earlier age. You know, she's good. Or maybe, maybe he's channeling her. Because the Italians believe that the Mussolini that they come to know over the 20s is as much her invention as his. In particular, one thought that they have come up with together is this idea that Italy has had it with the dithering political process. What Italy is ripe for, is begging for, is a strong man who would say, screw the niceties, give me power, and I will give you greatness. And that becomes the theme of virtually everything that Mussolini does from that point on. March 1919, he founds the Fascist Party in Milan. He's one of 4 founders. They're called the Quadrumvirs, and they are all 4 soldiers. They're veterans of the Great War. They have fought in this terrible war, as have many of their followers. The natural constituency of the Fascist Party is angry, disillusioned soldiers returned from fighting an absolutely stupid war that Italy got nothing from, and Mussolini knows how to keep them stirred up. Around the hateful peace table, Italy received but a few crumbs of the rich colonial booty gathered by others. From the beginning, violence is part of the fascist brand, but Mussolini keeps his hands pretty clean. The leg breaker of the party is his fellow quadrumvir, Italo Balbo. Balbo is to Mussolini what this guy is to Tony Soprano. And he forms these goon squads that in Italian are called squadistri, that break up the socialist newspapers and the political clubs and beat people up and occupy public spaces and so forth. Mussolini runs for office in 1921, and Balbo has got this great idea. He sends the squadistri into each polling place early in the morning, and the first guy that comes out after voting, they leap on him and they beat him up and they say, "You bastard, you voted for the socialists, or you voted for the Catholics, or not for us." And Balbo tells Mussolini, it's possible the guy did vote for us, but, you know, we're trying to send a message here. Yeah. With help like this, he's elected handily. In May 1921, here he is giving his maiden address before the Chamber of Deputies. The squadistri are still more active in 1922 through all of northern Italy. In particular, they're occupying town halls in Bologna, Ravenna, Parma, Trento, Tivoli, Trieste, Bolzano, Civitavecchia, Perugia, and Capua near Naples. They are everywhere. On September 20th, 1922, in the little town of Houdini in the northeast, Mussolini gives what it will be his checkers speech. This is what propels him to notice, not just within Italy, but internationally. It's called the famous Discourse at Houdini. And at this discourse, he tells them what the fascists are up to. Men are tired of liberty. They've had an orgy of it. For the intrepid youth who face the dawn of a new history, there are other words which have greater fascination. These are order, hierarchy, and discipline. Give up a few meaningless liberties, he's telling them, and I will give you order and discipline. I will make the trains run on time. He also tells them about violence. He says, violence is not immoral. Violence is decisive. And he talks about a metaphor, the cutting out of a cancer of the body, a violent act, right? But a necessary one. The cancer he intends to cut out of the Italian body politic is democracy, parliamentary democracy. Why? What's the case against democracy? It hasn't worked in Italy. It's given, parliamentary democracy has given Italy 7 governments in 3 years. It's given them 2,000 strikes in the year 1920 alone. He also tells them that the Fascist Party, made up largely, or the followers are largely soldiers, is the only political party with an army. And he's going to send that army marching on Rome to demand that the fascists be given control of the government. In fact, on October 27th, 3 columns of the fascist army leave Milan on the long walk to Rome with Mussolini and the other quadrumvirs in the van. Mussolini actually doesn't go the whole way. He scoots back to his office after only an afternoon of walking because he wants to be there when King Victor Emmanuel calls or telegrams to tell him, come on and form a new government. And in fact, on October 29th at noon, the telegram comes from the king, come form a new government. Mussolini takes the train, the 8:30 p.m. train, the Direttissimo from Milan to Rome, and he tells the crew, by God, this train is going to run exactly on time. And it does. It does. On November 16th, he convenes the Chamber of Deputies and he begins the cutting out of the cancer. He demands full emergency powers. That is the ability to rule without the checks of the court or the legislature, to make him dictator. They give him the full emergency powers, and he never gives them back. Now, we're temporarily going to leave Mussolini at this high point, but, I mean, what an accomplishment. 5 years to go from being a wounded veteran to dictator of the whole country. We'll come back to him.
Meanwhile, back in the United States, we were having our own craziness. In December 1917, the U.S. Senate proposed the 18th Amendment. The manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors is hereby prohibited. It was ratified a little over a year later, and a year after that, the country went totally dry. It was perhaps the worst act Congress ever passed. John D. Rockefeller, who was an early and important supporter of Prohibition, was to admit the year before it was repealed, drinking has greatly increased. The speakeasy has replaced the saloon. A vast army of lawbreakers has appeared. Many of our best citizens have openly ignored Prohibition. Respect for the law has been greatly lessened. Crime has increased to a level never seen before. This was coming from a supporter of Prohibition. And he wasn't the only do-gooder who got it wrong. The famous evangelist, Billy Sunday, had proclaimed to boisterous applause the week after the amendment was ratified, "The slums will soon be only a memory. We will turn our prisons into factories, our jails into corn cribs." But if they and so many other Americans got it wrong, it was hardly their fault. The idea of Prohibition was not a new one. In 1657, that's 2.5 centuries before the 18th Amendment, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which of course included Maine at that time, made it illegal to sell strong liquor to Indians. Their white brethren naturally could continue to drink as much as they wanted, and white Americans had long been big drinkers. It's estimated that in 1830, Americans consumed an average of nearly 2 quarts of hard liquor per week. That's 4 stiff drinks per day, every day, which is well over double, close to triple the average consumption in today's America. Drinking was indeed a problem and seen as such. In 1826, the American Temperance Society was formed. In 10 years, it had over 1.5 million members, or about 25% of all white adults at the time. The Prohibition movement, or the Dry Crusade, as it was also known, continued to grow in the first half of the 19th century. In 1851, the first state to outlaw alcohol, we're living in it, Maine, introduced total prohibition. And now for another completely irrelevant footnote. As a result of Maine's international prominence in promoting prohibition, the Manchester Temperance movement in England, which was a big deal there in the mid-19th century, managed somehow to get one of the most prominent streets in Manchester renamed Main Road. While the temperance movement was marginalized during our Civil War, when the war was over, it came back with a vengeance. The Prohibition Party was founded in 1869, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, 4 years later. Many prominent prohibitionists grew out of that movement. Perhaps the best known was Carrie Nation, 6 feet tall. She was a daunting foe, smashing up bars with hatchets accompanied by dozens of her hymn-singing apostles. She famously compared herself to a bulldog running along at the feet of Jesus, barking at what he doesn't like. She was arrested more than 30 times. She thought she was doing God's will. Indeed, believing that President McKinley had been a secret drinker, she publicly applauded his assassination, proclaiming he got what he deserved. In March of 1917, the congressional drives were clearly on the ascendancy, and it was a bipartisan ascendancy. The road ahead looked bright, even permanently so. When the 18th Amendment passed, its ecstatic author, he was a Democratic senator from Texas, Morris Shepherd, he proclaimed, "There is as much chance of repealing the 18th Amendment as there is for a hummingbird to fly to Mars with the Washington Monument tied to its tail." Not everyone, of course, was a supporter of prohibition. Very quickly, an active and obviously illegal trade developed between the U.S. and Canada, whose distilleries were now working overtime. England's Prince of Wales, who was subsequently to gain immortality by giving up his throne to marry a Baltimore divorcee, visited Canada shortly after Prohibition went into effect, and later regaled his father, King George V, with a limerick he had heard at a Canadian border town. 4 Yankees, feeling very dry, went across to Canada to get a drink of rye. When the rye was open, the Yanks began to sing, "God bless America, but God save the King." Winston Churchill, who had never hidden his taste for alcohol, was to write that prohibition was an affront to the whole history of mankind. By 1925, there were an estimated 100,000 speakeasies in New York City alone. You know, many were just holes in the wall, but others, opulent digs where the rich could bring their wives, who would never have entered a saloon in the pre-Prohibition days. Ironically, the speakeasy phenomenon was promoted, indirectly anyway, by the Republican presidents of the 1920s, Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge. They were both traditional small government conservatives against most federal spending. As a result, incredibly, only 1,500 federal agents were assigned across the entire country to enforce prohibition. As a result, organized crime was to flourish. 2 years after the country went dry, crime was up by 24%, and it continued to rise dramatically during the 1920s. Prohibition was a clear failure. The 18th Amendment was repealed on December 5th, 1933. Ironically, the state that provided the 36th vote necessary to meet the required 2/3 majority, that state was Utah, the only predominantly Mormon state in the country, and alcohol had been expressly forbidden to Mormons in one of Joseph Smith's revelations. But Utah's 21 members to the Constitutional Convention, a majority of whom were Mormons, voted unanimously to repeal prohibition. Alcohol may not be good for Mormons, but like most of the rest of the country, they realized that prohibition had been a disaster for the United States.
Talk about disaster. The League of Nations was a disaster, a failure from the beginning. It was envisioned by Wilson to be a world body, but the United States and Argentina opted out, and the Central Powers were not invited, nor was the Soviet Union, nor were any of the colonized areas. So what's left? What's left is a bunch of the full membership of the League, a bunch of chronically weak countries, and once strong countries who've been bankrupted by the First World War. In other words, they're all flat broke, more or less. Nonetheless, they open in Geneva in 1920, and they do what they can only do. They talk to each other. They have no money to invest in anything. Nobody is going to use military force no matter what, because they've just come through this horrible war. And they can't use sanctions because of all the non-member states that were ready to supply anything that they sanction against to whoever they sanction it for. So it's a failure. But let me tell you about one little success. It's a modest success. It's a temporary success. But it shows the pattern of what has to happen for a body like this to function at all. It involves two key figures. Austen Chamberlain, who is the Foreign Secretary of England, and his counterpart, the French Foreign Secretary, Aristide Briand. These two know each other. They've been involved at the League for a couple of years. They've formed a friendship. They get along really well. And they have some common ideas that they've worked out, which is all the little failures don't matter that much. What really matters, what would matter, is if we don't somehow get Germany back into the family of nations. If Germany has no continuing stake in a continuing peace, there will be no continuing peace, as Chamberlain has observed. So they need to bring Germany into the League of Nations. But how to do that? There are 100 reasons why it can't possibly join, and they're trying to go through these one by one to see what they could do about them. Meanwhile, in Germany, Gustav Stressman in Weimar is having the same thought. And in January 1925, he writes to Chamberlain proposing a treaty conference. Let's lock ourselves in a room and hammer out all the things we have to hammer out in order to bring Germany back into the League. Chamberlain loves the idea. He takes it and runs with it. He organizes the so-called Locarno Conference for the town that it met in between 5 and 16 October 1925. He sets out from London to meet Stressman. He's never met him before. He doesn't expect to like him because he's got this sense that Stressman's not just a German. I mean, he's a Prussian. And you know what Prussians, in Chamberlain's mind, are stiff-necked, thick-skulled, anti-Semitic. You know, he doesn't expect to like him at all. But when they meet, he finds somebody that's none of those things. He's a thoughtful, completely unpretentious man, a family man, deeply devoted to his Jewish wife, Keta, and his child. And Chamberlain finds, against all odds, that he likes the man. They form a friendship. Briand as well forms a relationship with Stressman. The village people in Locarno see the two of them renting a rowboat one afternoon after the hearings to row out onto the lake to enjoy a pleasant afternoon together. They come up with a peace treaty, a non-aggression treaty. That's what the Locarno Treaty is at its heart. France and Germany agree, mutual non-aggression treaty, and Britain agrees to guarantee the border between them. And they managed to put that all together, a bridge across their differences that's going to allow Germany then to enter the League, a bridge across their differences. But as they're doing this, they are also building a relationship between themselves, a friendship, a three-way friendship that they hope, and they have good reason to believe, they'll be able to bring back to their countries to be the basis of the friendship between those countries. As such, they're very like the peacekeepers at the Congress of Vienna, Metternich, Castlereagh, and Talleyrand. I got to tell you, the treaty, the Locarno Treaty, is eventually a failure. It's just not up to the havoc that the Depression brings in Germany. The death of Stressman throws the centrist parties completely out of kilter, and the Nazis come to power. It's just not a way. It's not up to that. So the treaty is a failure, but the mechanism that built it was a beautiful thing. I just wish we had diplomats like this negotiating on our behalf today.
And now, for yet another brief interlude of unmitigated optimism, the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, the world's most forgettable peace treaty. Created to renounce war as an instrument of international policy, like its predecessor, World War I, the war to end all wars, this was the peace treaty to end all wars. And it was just as successful in that regard as World War I had been. The pact was the unanticipated climax of an attempt by French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand to negotiate a bilateral non-aggression treaty with the United States, in which each would renounce going to war against the other. Frank Kellogg, he was our Secretary of State at the time, thought it a ridiculous idea, but rather than saying an outright no to our French ally, he suggested what he assumed was an impossible task, that Briand make it a multilateral treaty. Somehow, Briand brought the rest of Europe along, and the result was, as it was formally named, the General Treaty for the Renunciation of War. By 1934, 63 countries had signed on, which was virtually every established nation on earth at the time. George Kennan, you know, the famous George Kennan, the architect of our containment policy against the Soviet Union and one of the most sophisticated diplomats of the 20th century, described the pact as childish, just childish. Small wonder. The treaty to end all war went into effect the summer of 1929 and was soon followed by the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931, Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, Japan's invasion of China in 1937, Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939, the Soviet Union's invasion of Finland that same year, and Germany's invasion of pretty much the rest of Western Europe the following year, followed, of course, by World War II that climaxed with the dropping of 2 atom bombs and a death total of over 60 million. Since then, the pro-Kellogg-Briand historians, not a big crowd, I can assure you, have maintained that as a result of Kellogg-Briand, wars have been on the decline. There was always the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the 67 Israeli-Palestinian War, the 73 Israeli-Egyptian War, the nearly decade-long Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, our 2 wars against Saddam Hussein, and of course our ongoing war in Afghanistan, now stretching into its 17th year. But despite this record, and I'm unhappy to admit these 2 professors are Yale professors, Una Hathaway and Scott Shapiro, in their book, this was published last fall, The Internationalists, How a Radical Plan to Outline War Remade the World. They contend that the naysayers are wrong, that Kellogg-Briand was one of the key events of the 20th century. As we know, tenured professors can get away with anything. Maybe they concede the Kellogg-Briand Pact did not end war between states, but they claim it marked the beginning of the end. You just heard all the wars I mentioned. Indeed, they add it reshaped the map, catalyzed the human rights revolution, developed the use of economic sanctions, ignited the explosion in the number of international organizations, all of which they claim climaxed with the replacement of one international order with another. With war was replaced with peace. As George Orwell famously observed, there are some ideas so absurd, only an intellectual could believe them. Clearly, the key reason, as most historians point out, that the wars we've had since 1945 have been relatively limited in scope is the reality of mutual assured destruction. That, and the fact that after World War II, decolonization, the European powers were hurrying to give up the colonies they could no longer afford. They weren't fighting with each other any longer to establish new ones. Decolonization became the realistic approach. Had nothing to do with Kellogg-Briand. And then there's been the globalization of trade, not to mention various post-World War II security arrangements like positioning American troops in Europe and Asia, alliances like NATO and SEATO. As one historian noted, Dean Acheson and George Marshall deserve far more credit for keeping the peace than do the justly forgotten Aristide Briand and Frank Kellogg. The Kellogg-Briand Peace Pact, back to the dustbin of history, where Hathaway and Shapiro notwithstanding, it is surely to remain. So if you've been worried about a nuclear war with North Korea, maybe we can all relax, not because of Kellogg-Briand, but because even little Rocket Man knows all about mutual assured destruction.
Pope Pius XI and Mussolini come to power the same year, 1922. The Pope is cautiously supportive of the fascists, but he can't say so. He can't say that publicly because the Vatican and Italy are in a state of war with each other. Not a hot war, a cold war. It all dates back to the years before unification when the Pope was sovereign of what were called the Papal Estates, and they were progressively absorbed in 1870 and 1871 by the Italian unification, leaving only this tiny little enclave in downtown Rome, 108 acres, less than 1/8 the size of Central Park in New York. The Pope at the time, Pius IX, is not amused to find himself the sovereign of the smallest country on earth, and he refuses to acknowledge the legitimacy of Italy. And that's true between 1871 all the way into the 1920s. But Mussolini is a wild card here. He could, because he has advocated a peace treaty between the Vatican and Italy to bring them back together and to bring the Catholic Church back into the public square of Italy. He's done that because he's a good Catholic, right? Wrong. He's an atheist. He lives flagrantly with his Jewish girlfriend. He has, back in the boondocks, a common law wife and 5 out of wedlock children. No, this is because it's going to play really well with his base, which is Catholic. It's largely Catholic. So he proposes this, and the Pope loves the idea. He can't talk directly to Mussolini himself because of the state of war, but he does appoint an intermediary, a Jesuit priest named Father Pietro Tacchi Venturi. I was brought up Catholic, and I just have this feeling that priests ought not to look so scary as that. You know? Priests ought to look... But here's what we've got. And Venturi and Mussolini meet hundreds of times in secret. Also meeting with Mussolini at least dozens of times is the Vatican Secretary of State, Eugenio Pacelli, who will become Pius XII, and his brother, Francesco Pacelli, who is drafting the peace conference, the peace treaty, which will be signed, the Lateran Accords, signed on February 11th, 1929. And Italy and the Vatican, for the first time, exchange ambassadors. Well, now the Pope is free to speak his mind. And he says, I do not see in the complex of fascist doctrines anything that is contrary to Catholic teaching. Wow! I mean, what a coup for Mussolini. You can't buy this kind of testimonial. And Mussolini's popularity, which had already been pretty good, spikes in 1929, and he goes above 80%. I read in one of the biographies of Mussolini that the press at this time, not just the fascist press, but the mainstream press, which had been sort of respectful, but now becomes obsequious to the extent that they're using a capital letter on the pronoun when it refers back to Mussolini. I thought, that would be blasphemy. You can't do that. So we looked through some of the Italian documents that we had, and I used my Italian is not perfect, so I used a translator. And sure enough, they're capitalizing the pronoun. I mean, wow. So Mussolini's riding high. But all is not well. All is not well in Italy, because roiling under the surface is something really ugly. It's anti-Semitism. But it's not the fascists who are anti-Semitic. At this point, it's the Catholic Church, which in its house organ, La Civiltà Cattolica, is pretty explicit about what it thinks of the Jews. Now, I point out to you, this is not dog whistle stuff. I mean, this is the real thing. And I just picked one of many wonderful quotes from the Civiltà Cattolica. I can remember being brought up Catholic, the priest telling us in church school, saying, well, the Pope has assured us that because the Jews killed Jesus, that all Jews forever after bear a racial, an eternal hereditary guilt for that monstrous act. And I was upset by that because my best friend at the time, Johnny Rosine, was Jewish. And I wanted to leap to my feet and say, Father, wait a minute. Hold on. Those guys that killed Jesus, the ones with the shoe brushes on their helmets, that nailed him to the cross, they're not Jews. They're Romans. And now, Father, correct me if I got this wrong. Romans are from Italy, right? They're Italians. I mean, let's face it. The Italians killed Jesus. And they've been trying to pin it on somebody else ever since. Right? I didn't actually say any of that because mom would have been annoyed, But anyway, Sarfati is very much aware of what's going on, the negotiations with the church and the church attitudes toward Jews. She realizes it's no longer safe. It's going to be no longer safe to be Jewish in Italy. And so she decides to convert to Catholicism. She needs a priest to do the actual conversion ceremony. She doesn't know a priest, so she turns to Mussolini, and he supplies for her Father Dracula here, who does the actual baptism, and she is instantly absolved for guilt for the death of Jesus. Mussolini is at the top of his game with the support of the Pope. I mean, what do you need? Violence is a thing of the past. He doesn't need it anymore to maintain his control. Italians are content. The economy is booming. The trains run on time. He is, for the moment, in the catbird seat. But unfortunately, 1929 has yet another surprise in store for us.
The Great Depression. It lasted over 10 years. We could spend the entire 100 minutes talking about it, but instead I'm going to cover it in just a couple of minutes. It began, of course, with the stock market crash, Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929. By the end of October, just a week later, the market had fallen more than 40% from its highs in September. American exports, which had totaled $5.2 billion in 1929, almost disappeared over the next 3 years. Commodity prices, especially farm products, wheat, cotton, tobacco, lumber, collapsed, wiping out millions of small farmers. During the first 3 years after the stock market crash, President Hoover only exacerbated the problem, raising interest rates and allowing the supply of dollars to contract in a free fall. As a result, 744 American banks failed in 1930, a foretaste of the more than 9,000 that would fail during the next few years. In the 3-year period from October 1929 through 1932, industrial production fell nearly 50%. Rampant deflation drove wholesale prices down by about 35%. And the worst statistic, unemployment rose over 600% in those 3 years. 1 in 4 working Americans had no jobs, no income, and of course there was no Social Security. In 1929, the American economy was one of the largest in the world, so our depression had an obvious and pretty quick impact abroad. Traveling around the English countryside in 1933, the British writer J.P. Priestley observed, "If T.S. Eliot ever wants to write a poem about a real wasteland instead of a metaphysical one, he should come here." Tens of thousands of banks collapsed across Europe. Hundreds of thousands of businesses went bankrupt, and the political situation was exploding. As we know, in January 1933, the Nazis came to power, and they were freely elected. President Hoover had done nothing to alleviate the disaster. Franklin Roosevelt, sworn in as president 2 months after the Nazis came to power, made what proved to be a half-hearted attempt to deal with it, the New Deal. Designed to create a large number of new jobs, it was really a drop in the bucket to what was actually needed, which was a massive amount of deficit spending to raise the economy from its moribund state. And moribund it was. Now I'm going to get a little technical here for a moment. Instead of really stimulating the economy, the national debt was increased by only $3 billion during that entire decade of the 1930s, the decade of the Depression. By contrast, in 1942, our first year in the Second World War, we created debt of $23 billion. Now that would have been stimulation. The following year, we tripled that, adding an additional $64 billion to our debt load. World War II obviously had its roots in the Depression. As Tom mentioned, we were rebuilding the German economy in the 1920s. The Depression stopped that dead, and as we know, brought the Nazis to power in 1933. So time for a big if. If Hoover and Roosevelt had applied the right remedies and done some serious deficit spending, say just half of what the U.S. spent in only the first year of World War II, could they have damped down the Depression before it spread abroad, bringing with it Nazi rule to Germany? And then maybe World War II would never have happened?
By the time fascism emerges in Germany, Mussolini's been in power for 11 years. He has a fairly dim view of his German counterpart, calls him at one point a mad little clown. Nonetheless, they do exchange visits, and the Mac and Tom Show has been able to acquire some authentic footage of one of their visits. As you see, it's not a marriage made in heaven. But they need each other. They need each other because each one of them has territorial ambitions. They want to play on the international stage. Mussolini, in particular, would like to pick off a colony. Great powers have colonies, right? England has colonies. So he wants a colony. So his mind his eyes turn to that continent that God set aside for colonization. Unfortunately, mostly taken at this point. However, there's this one little corner that nobody's laid claims to, and so he sets his sights on that. And on October 2nd, 1935, he convenes an enormous crowd in front of his office at the Piazza Venezia, and he announces his intention to invade Ethiopia. The crowd goes wild. The best day of any war is the first day. Sarfati is not enthusiastic. She observes this from afar, obviously disquieted, and a friend who's with her says, well, what's the trouble? Don't you think he'll be able to pull it off? He's not going to be able to defeat Ethiopia. She said, I think he will, but only with German help, and that's going to drive him into the arms of Germany. On October 3rd, 1935, the Italian force invades Ethiopia, and Mussolini calls on his trusted lieutenants, the other quadrumvirs. So De Bono is the general who leads the Italian army into Ethiopia. Balbo has now been made air minister, and he supplies air cover to De Bono's army. And De Vecchi is now the Vatican ambassador. He keeps the Pope in line. The Pope is very supportive of the war. The resistance is quite pronounced, and the war drags on. And sure enough, exactly as Sarfati had predicted, Mussolini is obliged to appeal to the Germans for aircraft, munitions, and armament. And then from this point on, he begins dancing to a German tune. He goes so far as to pass the copycat law of the German race law. That happens on November 11th, 1938. The law for the defense of the races, which has all kinds of things that the Ebrei are Jews, are not allowed to do, like hold office and own companies and have servants and things like that. The man who has thought of himself and been thought of by the Italians as Il Duce, the leader, is now little more than a German puppet. So much so that on June 10th, 1940, another enormous crowd gathers in the Piazza Venezia for Mussolini to announce to them that he is declaring war on England and France, joining Germany in the Second World War. The crowd goes wild. The best day of any war is the first day. Now this looks like a triumph from this picture, but it's not. It's a blunder, a monumental blunder. This is a man who has made many mistakes along the way, but always come out on his feet. You know, at one point you might think he could shoot somebody on the Via Veneto, and that his base wouldn't desert him. But this is different. This is a fatal error, and neither Italy nor Mussolini will survive it. So let me turn you away from this effectively unhappy moment to one that seemed at least to be more positive. Let me take you back to November 16th, 1922. You remember that was the time immediately after the March on Rome, when Mussolini has gained full powers and has been made dictator of Italy. His fellow quadrumvir Italo Balbo comes to him after the ceremony and says, "Did you notice that the actual seizure of power involved no bloodshed whatsoever?" And Mussolini said, "By design, it had to be that way. Blood begets blood. And I don't want to end up like Cola di Rienzo. And he mentions the name that every Italian schoolchild knows of a 14th century charismatic but very violent warlord, known for the grisly murders he used to maintain his power. How did Cola di Rienzo end up? What is it that Mussolini doesn't want to end up like? Well, one grisly murder too many, and he was set upon by the crowd and beaten and kicked to death in the streets and strung up by his heels in the town square. Maybe he's got an inkling of the fate that lies in store for him.
Well, Tom, as this is our final chapter, we're certainly not going to end on such a grim note. Let's try to be at least a little upbeat. What do you think, Tom, as we wrap it up? Can you try to be positive, please?
Okay. Positive thinking. Positive.
I mean, granted, the history of the 1930s, as we just saw, has some unpleasant moments. But was it really such a grim decade on the whole? I mean, if we discount the natural bias of historians, who, after all, can be a pretty gloomy lot.
I suppose, Mac, if we set our minds to it, we could tell our audience the history of the 1930s without all the, the bad spin, with all the gloomy part that we want to give you a fair and balanced history.
Well, of course, the problem is that historians get a lot of their source material from the press, and the press of the period was offering up nothing but bad news.
That's journalists for you, nothing but bad news.
No wonder enlightened minds today are considering revoking the licenses of the fake news media, huh? Serves them right, no?
Serves them right. Now take that depression, for example. Was it really so depressing as the press would have it? I mean, yeah, sure, some people were having a bit. You have to look at the bright side of it.
That's a great idea, Tom. What exactly was the bright side?
Whatever. In Italy, things weren't as bad. Not as bad as here, for example. That's because the Italians were investing a lot to keep people working. We're doing a lot of infrastructure projects. 16,000 public schools being built during the early years of the Depression, and a new transatlantic liner, which, thank you, Harvey Ardman, made the the transatlantic crossing record in 1932. All of this to keep people working.
Well, you've got a good point, Tom. And now that I think about it, in Germany as well, there were lots of infrastructure projects to keep folks working. Now, of course, in both cases, it was all paid for with deficit financing.
Those gloomy historians would tell you that it was just dumb luck that Germany and Italy happened upon exactly the remedy that John Maynard Keynes would tell us is the only thing to do during a depression is to stimulate the economy.
Indeed. Some very thoughtful people were thinking maybe fascism is the key. Italy and Germany both doing a little better than we were during the Depression. They're both fascists.
Well, one person thinking those very thoughts, Mac, was the British intellectual Oswald Mosley, Sir Oswald Mosley. He had paid a visit in 1936 to Italy, and he brought back some of Mussolini's fine ideas, and he soon was seen marching around London with followers in black shirts.
Yeah, and he was giving some speeches as fiery as any that Mussolini was giving.
If you think the present system of things can really see you through, then it's idle for our new and virile faith of fascism. I come to you with a new and revolutionary conception of politics, of economics, and of life itself.
Obviously powerful stuff, and in the United States too. We had our own Oswald Mosley in a way. It was a Catholic priest from Michigan, Father Charles Coughlin.
Now, you might think that our beloved Rush Limbaugh was the first one to combine radio with right-thinking conservatism and religion, but no. Father Coughlin was there before him. In fact, he was known as the radio priest.
On May 11th, 1936, Father Coughlin gave an address in front of, at the Cleveland Major League Stadium, and he addressed some problems that all real Americans are concerned about.
You appreciate the fact, my dear friends, that among other things in the National Union for Social Justice, We are Christian insofar as we believe in Christ's principle of love your neighbor as yourself, and with that principle, I challenge every Jew in this nation to tell me that he does not believe in it.
Meanwhile, back in Europe, Germany was on the move, marching into the Rhineland, which it had accepted as part of Versailles would remain a demilitarized zone.
But it's the Rhineland, right? It's still part of Germany, so what's the big deal? And anyway, the French and the English didn't do anything about it, so it was perfectly natural that Germany would conclude that it had been forgiven for its little peccadillo of starting the Great War.
And so Germany moved again, this time into Austria.
The Brits are appalled by this, at least they say they're appalled by it. They don't actually do anything.
Yeah, but Austria is one thing. Germany would never dream of intruding into any non-German speaking country like Czechoslovakia, for example.
Except maybe for just that one little area of almost entirely German-speaking people around the edge, which probably should have been part of Germany anyway, right?
On September 12, 1939, at a modest gathering in Nuremberg, a German spokesperson explains very calmly that Czechoslovakia is a fraudulent state anyway and promises to support the right of self-determination for the Sudeten Germans.
And on September 18th, Italy's Benito Mussolini announces his support for the German position.
And on September 29th, English Prime Minister Chamberlain and French Prime Minister Daladier arrive in Munich to meet with the Italians and the Germans.
At 1:30 a.m. the following morning, the Munich Agreement was signed.
It granted Germany the Sudetenland and de facto control over the rest of Czechoslovakia.
But with a very important qualifier. The Germans were obliged to promise to go no further.
Later that morning, Chamberlain, an excited Chamberlain, flew back to London where he announced the details of his historic deal with Germany.
So our Prime Minister has come back from his third and greatest journey, and he said
that the settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace. This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the high point that we promised to end on. Peace for our time, a triumph of diplomacy. Thank you, Neville Chamberlain. And that brings us to the very end of the Mac and Tom show.
No, wait, Tom. We're not going to tell them what happens next?
Oh, don't even think of it. It will ruin our upbeat ending. This is the point in each year's Mac and Tom show where we turn it over to Mac DeFord for a wrap-up to say what it is, how any of this relates to the present. What does it all mean? And last year, Mac, you did your wrap-up in a single sentence. Could you do that again?
One sentence, Tom, to wrap up 20 years of history joining the two world wars of the 20th century? Okay, there's that great George Santayana quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are doomed to repeat it." Pretty much sums up what our 100 minutes of history has been about. Though, of course, there's no guarantee, as we learned from Neville Chamberlain, that even those who do remember history won't see it repeated.
Thank you.